Would like to acknowledge my co-authors on this. It's been a real team effort. So Kate Martin and Nisha Stelwright from Fish and Wildlife Service, Matt Sexton when he was at the USGS, Brian Daniels, who is the waterfowl biologist at the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge, Maria Spriggs from Busch Gardens, Tampa Bay, and Gwen Myers from Zoo Miami. And I will be talking about spectacled eiders today, which you can see here in this photo, a male on the left and a female on the right. Spectacled eider is not their only name, especially for the folks that live closest to these birds. In the Yukon Delta, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region of Alaska, in Yupik and Chupik, they're known as Kayak. And I'm sure if Randall, if you're on, you're laughing right now at that pronunciation. On St. Lawrence Island in Siberian Yupik, they're Aitalek. And then in Inupiaq, they're Kavasuk. I think one of the things I'll miss most about doing in-person talks is the laughter that my pronunciation of those native names often gets, but I'll try to kind of insert it there myself. It took a lot of other additional people to make this work successful, so I would like to recognize them too for their contributions as well. And I wanted to start with this. It's a photo of Audubon magazine, Birding magazine, from 1996, and I was in college at this time. The cover story, as you can see, is the spectacled eider. And I can remember really well seeing this article and reading it and just being blown away by these birds and where they live and the people who study them. So to be here today to share this information with you is really kind of a dream come true. It also shows that really important work has been going on with these birds for 30 or 40 years now. So our team is just building on that work, and we've got a lot to draw from. I'd also like to point out, let me turn on my pointer, that this magazine was actually a subscription my mom had. So I'd like to thank my mom and my dad as well. They're in Rhode Island, so hopefully this isn't too late for them and they're able to tune in. So with that, thanks for indulging that bit of nostalgia. So I'll be talking today about a lot about birds and a lot about sea ice. And in this figure, it's showing Arctic sea ice extent in September, which is the time when sea ice is at its lowest point with time, so year on the x-axis. And the years go all the way up to 2100 because these colored lines are modeled projections for how much sea ice there'll be given these different climate scenarios. The black line here is actual observed data until 2019. And the point of showing this to you is to show that the rate of decline of sea ice in the Arctic is going a lot faster than what the models have predicted. And in fact, the red line here is if you follow the current trend out into the future, we will be looking at an Arctic that is ice-free in the summer in the next 20 or 30 years rather than the next 100 years. So the future is now. Sea ice is really important for a lot of high latitude species. The three species pictured here, the polar bear, the bearded seal, and the ring seal, are all ice dependent species and species that are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act because their survival and reproduction depends on sea ice. Spectacled eiders, as you will see, are also associated with sea ice. The nature of that association is something we don't fully understand yet. Are they associated or are they dependent? How important is the sea ice to the eider? And that is something we don't know yet. But given the status and trend of ice in the Arctic, it's something we will be finding out about. So this is a video. I hope it shows up. I have some photos here as well if it doesn't. So if this looks terribly pixelated, don't worry. So this is a video taken by Matt Sexton. Can you see it, Gay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, Great. So Matt Sexton took this video during his work with the USGS in 2010. He was on the US Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. So this is from a helicopter showing spectacled eiders in their wintering habitat. So spectacled eiders use these open water leads in the pack ice in the North Bering Sea, and they use these open water leads to forage. They dive 40 to 70 meters to feed primarily on clams. Clams are a hard-shelled animal, and the eiders swallow them whole. So that requires a lot of time to digest. So they haul out on the ice to roost and to digest their prey. It is a hard way to make a living, and you get a sense of that here. It's cold, it's dark, and this ice is dynamic. It's constantly moving. Sometimes there are a lot of opportunities to forage, sometimes there are not. Sometimes these openings happen to fall over areas that have good prey, and sometimes they don't. And if the video didn't show up very well, here's a photo. This photo is taken by Bill Learned, who is a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Management. And Bill has actually flown several aerial surveys over the wintering area to photograph and to count these birds. And you can see these flocks can be very large. The largest flock that they've documented was over 100,000 individual eiders, and that's a third of the world population in one flock. They're not always in large flocks, and there aren't always large leads for them to feed in. So here's a photo of a smaller flock and a smaller lead. So keep in mind that these openings are always changing and they're moving. So it's a very dynamic environment. Jim Lavorne at Southern Illinois University has done some really cool work where he's looked at kind of how these birds make their living in this harsh environment. You know, what their income is in terms of food under certain conditions, get in that in comparison to what their energetic costs are. You know, that said, it's a hard place to live, but this is the environment that spectacled eiders are adapted to. So my point here is that sea ice is a dynamic and critical part of the wintering habitat for spectacled eiders. Here's a map showing where you can find the spectacled eider if you're looking. The areas here indicated in red are the places where they make nests and raise their ducklings. So in Alaska, important breeding areas are the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta region in Western Alaska, the Arctic coastal plain, and then the Arctic coast of Siberia and Russia. These lighter blue areas are areas that are used by eiders to molt their flight feathers in the fall. And then their wintering area is shown here in this dark blue oval south of St. Lawrence Island. If you're not familiar with the geography in this area, take note of this map. St. Lawrence Island will be shown numerous times in figures throughout this talk. Folks that live in communities along the coast of Alaska know these birds well. You know, spectacled eiders are their yard birds. They see them all the time, especially on the YK Delta and in Utqiagvik as well, and especially St. Lawrence Island. St. Lawrence Island is essentially on a spectacled eider highway as these birds travel from breeding areas, wintering areas to breeding areas to molting areas, and then molting areas to the wintering area. When they do breed, they're only on land for 3 months. So the rest of the year, they're in the marine environment. So these truly are marine birds. And they spend five or six of those months in this area south of St. Lawrence Island. So this is a satellite photograph in mid-March of 2010 showing what the sea ice looks like. The blue points on this photo are satellite transmitter locations from transmitters that Matt Sexton and Margaret Peterson put out between 2008 and 2010 in their work with the U.S. Geological Survey. And those are all locations from the month of February. The red points are observations of flocks seen during an aerial survey that was flown in March. So my point in showing this is just that the locations in February predicted really well where they found the birds when they went and looked in March. So they're not moving around very much typically during the winter, within a winter. Additional to that, the surveys that Bill Learned has flown, they find the flocks in the same general area each year that they've gone to count them. And the flocks here, the points here are the flocks that were documented during those aerial surveys. The different colors are different years of the survey. This red square is the area we call the core wintering habitat. It's based on the satellite telemetry work that Margaret Peterson did in the 1990s. And this was the area of concentrated use that those marked birds did. Subsequent work has shown that they use an area that's broader than that, but we still use this red square to quantify what the sea ice is like on the wintering habitat. So I'll be referring to core Spectacled Eider wintering habitat a bit in this talk. And when I say that, this is the area I'm referring to. So sea ice in the Bering Sea has always shown annual variation, but lately it's been dramatically low since 2014. In fact, work using stable isotopes of oxygen from peak cores from St. Matthew Island indicate that this is the lowest sea ice has been in the last 5,000 years. And that shows up really, really well in these satellite images. So from March 2010, here's St. Lawrence Island. You can see that the northern Bering Sea is almost entirely covered in ice. And compare that to March of 2018, when south of St. Lawrence Island is almost entirely ice-free, and you have these large areas of open water north of the island into the Bering Strait. One really important thing that I have not mentioned yet is that spectacled eiders are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. They were listed because of dramatic declines in Western Alaska in that breeding area that occurred starting in, the decline started in 1950s and continued into the 1990s. More recently, numbers are increasing. But because they're listed occasionally, intermittently, the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to review their status, and that's a species status assessment. And that is occurring now. And given the changes in sea ice, there was a real need to revisit what distribution and abundance in the winter was. So to do that, we initiated this project to deploy satellite transmitters. And we did that by capturing birds on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in May of 2018. We deployed 39 transmitters. These satellite transmitters, I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit about how they work. And they were providing locations every 2 to 6 days. So how do you catch a spectacled eider, you might be wondering. So I'm going to show some time-lapse photography of setting up a net. It's a mist net, so it's a very fine net that's hard for the birds to see. We also set up decoys that attract them in. And we rarely ever catch any other birds in these nets because they are really easy to see. And if you're any bird that's smaller than a spectacled eider, you're a much more agile flyer and you can avoid them, so they can see the net and they avoid it. But of course, because I put the camera out, we captured 2 bycatch shorebirds. You can see I hold them up to the camera if you can ID them. The first one right there is a black turnstone and then a redneck phalarope. Which we released and they were fine. But you know, the way this works is pretty simple. Put out the decoys, the birds are attracted to the decoys, they don't see the net and they fly into the net, and there you have a spectacled eider. The most important bit of equipment is really warm clothes because this requires lying around a lot waiting for the eiders to come. The transmitters themselves, they collect data on the temperature of the bird and the voltage of the battery. And then you program them to intermittently send that information, transmit it to satellites that are passing overhead. And how the frequency of the signal changes as the satellite passes by is actually what provides the location of the transmitter. And we're not the first people to do this. This was first done, the first person to make use of what at that time was pretty new technology was Margaret Peterson in the 1990s. And then Margaret and Matt Sexton did this again more recently between 2008 and 2012. So the transmitters themselves are surgically implanted in the birds. So you might ask, why implant a transmitter? Why not use a harness and put it on the outside of the bird? Well, eiders live in cold places with cold water, and their feathers are really important for staying warm. So if you put anything on the outside of an eider that disrupts its feather, it's a lot like putting a big hole in your down jacket during the winter. They can't handle it. Internal transmitters don't cause that problem. They do require surgery, which is something I don't do. We are lucky to work with two amazing veterinarians to do this hard work. In this photo, Dr. Glenn Myers from Zoo Miami is doing a surgery. You can see the transmitter in yellow. We also work with Dr. Maria Spriggs from Busch Gardens, Tampa Bay. And they both are constantly improving and refining this technique to make it less stressful on the birds. So each one of these birds is a significant investment and has the potential to provide a lot of important information for the conservation of the species, but we get no return on that investment if the bird doesn't survive and thrive after the surgery. So you can imagine that these protocols come with a lot of oversight and a lot of care is used. These surgeries are done the same way a surgery would be done if you went to the hospital to have surgery. Using anesthesia, so the bird is unconscious and doesn't feel any pain. All of the instruments are sterilized to prevent infection, and the birds are given analgesic medicine after the surgery to reduce post-surgical pain, and are closely monitored by the veterinarian before they are released. And because a picture is worth 1,000 words, here's a video of, oh, it should be a video. How do I get to play? There, a video of an eider after surgery being released, and she flies right away, and obviously looks really good. So we'll get into some results of this work. So I'll be showing a series of maps that summarize the transmitter locations, but instead of showing individual points, I'll be showing these colored areas. And these colored areas are a way to summarize the areas used by the birds during each month in this case. So it's a way to kind of integrate space use. They're not just using a single point, they're using the area around the point. So these maps kind of show these colored areas based on the density of points. Each individual bird will be shown in a different color. So we'll start here in November, and you can see most birds have arrived on the wintering area by this time already. There's one bird that is making a movement from the Bering Sea coast to the Chukaka Peninsula, where it probably molted, to the wintering site. Most spectacled eiders arrive on the wintering area in October through November. There's no ice in the area at that time. In December, you can see all those colored areas kind of stacked up on top of each other, showing that all the birds that we had transmitters in were south of St. Lawrence Island in December of 2018. In January, by this time, ice is moving in, and still the birds remain south. In February, things get a little wacky. You can start to see movements by some eiders north of the island. Northward movements like these are not typical during winters of high ice. Through March, there are marked eiders from south of St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Sea and Arctic coastlines of the Chukaka Peninsula. And these areas typically aren't available this time of year. And I'd be really interested in hear what folks on St. Lawrence Island have seen, if they've noticed an increase in the number of eiders passing by in late winter during March and in April during these years of low ice compared to years of high ice. What these transmitters give us that observations don't is the kind of continuous movement path of individual birds even after they go out of sight. So kind of summarizing these patterns, there were 3 apparent patterns in late winter. We'll call this group the home bodies. These are the 5 birds that stayed where we would expect them to be this time of year, and that near the core area south of St. Lawrence Island. And if you look at the maximum distance moved during March, they didn't move very much. They didn't move very far. The second group of birds we'll call the coasters. So these birds were close to the south and southeast coastlines of St. Lawrence Island, and they didn't move very much either. Only the maximum movement was 87 kilometers. And this is an area that spectacled eiders do use in the winter, but they typically use it earlier in the winter before the ice arrives. And once the ice arrives, they move to the southwest. And then the third group of birds we can call the travelers. So these are the 7 birds that made movements north of St. Lawrence Island to the Bering Sea coasts and Arctic coastlines of the Chukotka Peninsula. Their movements, in contrast, were much larger. So the maximum movement in this group of birds was over 1,000 kilometers. So kind of summarizing this, we saw individual variation by bird. Not all the birds did the same thing. Some eiders stay, some eiders left. We really, at this point, don't understand what motivates those decisions. Are the birds that are moving, the birds that are in poor condition, are desperate to find better foraging, so they make these risky movements, or are they birds that are in better condition and can afford to make these movements? Or it could be something entirely different. But this is a pattern that we haven't seen before, especially these longer movements and prolonged. In the past, birds have moved to the north of St. Lawrence Island when there are winds out of the south, but they're always forced back south from the north. This figure is just another way of looking at the same information. So it's plotting latitude of the transmitters with time, starting in November of 2018 through April of 2019. St. Lawrence Island is at about 63.5 degrees north latitude, and you can see that's where the birds are. You hit mid-February, and then there's a lot more variation with birds going as far as 70 degrees north. What's interesting is when you pair this plot showing variation in latitude with this figure showing what the ice and what the weather was doing during this same period. So the blue line here is showing the sea ice extent, and these data are from satellites. The higher the line goes, the more ice there is. The red arrows are wind vectors, indicating the direction of the wind and the strength of the wind. And then the lower dashed line is showing ambient air temperature. And you can see that the ice extent increased through December and into January. During this period of increase, the winds were consistently out of the north, and the ambient temperature was consistently low. So these are conditions that promoted ice formation. Things changed in February. If you look at what the winds are doing, the winds were consistently out of the south, and ambient temperatures were warmer, which led to this rapid deterioration in ice. And actually this period, with all of these arrows pointing to the north, showing winds out of the south, there was a series of 15 consecutive low pressure systems that moved through the Bering Sea at this time. The ice made a bit of resurgence in March, but that didn't last long. So the take home here, so these lines, these vertical lines, indicate when the ice extent went north of St. Lawrence Island, and the movements by some of the eiders we had marked correlated with the ice. So movements north correlated with loss of ice cover, which in turn was related to temperature and wind. So I'm going to show an animation that puts the satellite transmitter locations together with sea ice concentration data from satellites. The ice will be shown in gray. So here it is to the far north. The darker black color is open water. The transmitters are in red. And these transmitters are going to jump around a lot. Remember that they're not providing continuous information. They're turning on every 2 to 6 days. And for that reason, they're going to jump around. So in general, in 2018, ice is very late in forming, but it did eventually show up. The birds through January where we'd expect them to be. The maximum sea ice extent occurred in January of 2019, which is 2 months earlier than normal. Where in February, you can see the ice gets retreating up through the Bering Strait and the birds moving. Here's that resurgence in March, and then the ice is gone, essentially. If you notice too, there are locations by April 1st of Eiders on returning to the breeding grounds here in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And this is over 6 weeks earlier than average. So what's the take home here? So we found that Eiders were not going anywhere new. These more northern areas are within their typical range. They are just not going there at the usual time of year, mid to late winter. This movement was enabled by low ice cover caused by consistent southerly winds. Only a subset of the marked birds took advantage of this open water habitat to the north. So there's this variation in individual behavior, which led to a lot more variation in movement. So there was a lot more variation in movement during a winter with low ice than during a winter with high ice. So how is this relevant? How could this fit into the bigger picture of what we know about spectacled eiders? So this is work that was recently published by Christie et al. And it shows 23 years of annual survival of spectacled eiders. And these data come from a banding study on Kigiak Island in the Yukon-Kuskokwim region of Alaska. So on the y-axis here is survival probability. So 0 here means everyone's dead. 1 means everyone survives. Each one of these points is an estimate of survival for the marked spectacled eiders in that year. So if you look kind of average survival, if you were to draw a straight line through these data, average survival is around 78%. So in an average year, 78% of the eiders survive to return to the breeding ground. On the x-axis here on the bottom, these numbers are counts of the number of days when ice cover on the core wintering area, which remember is the square south of St. Lawrence Island, when ice cover in that area was greater than 95%. And you can see once you get up to 80 days or more of high ice cover in that area, survival declined. So this pattern makes sense. Years of high ice cover limit the available foraging habitat and increase energy demands of keeping warm. At the other end of the x-axis here, we have years where there just wasn't much ice in this core area. And this average survival is getting pulled downward by these 2 years. So over 23 years of data, there were only 2 years where there was around 20 or less days of high ice in the core area. So it seems like, this is a Goldilocks situation where moderate ice cover is optimal for spectacled eiders, but the extremes, certainly at high, this is a really convincing result. And potentially at the low, with only 2 data points, it's hard to make any strong conclusion from this. But if you relate this to work that Jim Lavorne did with his energetic models, it makes some sense. So that work shows that this low ice effect might be related to the absence of ice for roosting. So instead of hanging out on ice to digest and rest, the eiders have no ice and they have to swim constantly. And you might think, well, how is that a big deal? They show up there in October. So October, November, December, they're constantly swimming. They obviously can do it. And that's a good point too, but by January, they've been swimming for 3 months. The days are short, the weather's cold, they're probably ready for a break. So this is a potential explanation if this pattern of low survival with low ice is real, but we can't say that yet. This banding study ran through 2015. So of course, every year since this study stopped has been low ice, unfortunately. If we look at what ice cover in this core area has been doing, this figure shows ice data summarized for that core wintering area going back until 1979. The blue line is the count of days where ice cover is over 95%, and the red line is the count of days where ice cover was less than 15%. And so note that variation is not unusual. The amount of ice in the Bering Sea varies from year to year, but it's been random. The amount of variation and the direction of the variation since 2014 is the big change. So now it's consistently low ice and a level of low ice that really we haven't seen in this kind of brief record. And the stable isotope study that looked at peat cores from St. Matthew Island indicates that ice hasn't been this low in 5,000 years. So if we revisit the survival plot, the area that's highlighted here in red is these are the conditions that spectacled eiders are experiencing now. So we don't have data on what survival is when the number of high ice days is less than 20. Never mind when highest days is 0. So we really don't know. But if survival is truly low during low ice days, then we can expect to see population decline. But again, at this point, we don't really have sufficient data to make that conclusion. And when you look at the numbers from the survey work that Fish and Wildlife Service does in Alaska every year, the numbers of breeding numbers in Alaska are stable. So we don't have any indication based on breeding counts of a decline. So how may loss of sea ice affect spectacled eiders? That's a complicated question. And that's why this is such a busy slide. This is the dramatic decline in sea ice, and it's recent, so we don't have a good understanding yet. But the loss of sea ice certainly has the potential to affect spectacled eiders through a number of potential pathways. One being changes in distribution. So returning to this picture where there are tens of thousands of eiders in a single lead in the ice. This is kind of the equivalent of having all of your eggs in one basket. So relating this back to the work that Caroline Van Hemert and Matt Smith do and talked about a few weeks ago, if a pathogen like avian cholera got into this flock, it would be really devastating for the population. So the opportunity for birds to be more dispersed across the bigger area could have benefits from that perspective. It also opens up more foraging areas, and those foraging areas, in fact, might be better foraging areas than what's available south of St. Lawrence Island. This is a figure showing benthic biomass from Lynn et al. In 2019, indicating that there's high biomass to the north of St. Lawrence Island. But foraging might not be the only or most important part of the story. And this gets back to the work that Jim Lavorne did, showing that ice doesn't just limit the amount of foraging habitat that's available. Ice also provides important roosting habitat for these birds. A really timely topic is also vessel traffic. So the distribution of eiders isn't the only thing that's changing. The distribution of vessels in the Bering Sea is also changing. Stocks of commercially important fishes are moving north with warming temperatures. With those fish, fishing vessels are also moving north as far as they can. So the limit for commercial fishing is the Arctic right now. And in years when there's not much ice or no ice, the commercially important fish move into those areas. So you have commercial fishing vessels in areas they typically don't fish in when there's low ice. The same is true with transportation, with barges and barge traffic. And most recently, very recently, there was video of ice breaking liquefied natural gas tankers traveling from China to Siberia through ice. And kind of most importantly, and kind of really big picture, is the ecological change that the loss of ice brings to this system. When there is not ice in the winter, the temperature of the water increases and the bottom temperature increases. And that really structures the community of fish in this area. So when that changes, the whole system changes in ways that we can and cannot necessarily anticipate. So all of these things certainly warrant further attention. The Bering Sea is changing, spectacled eider distribution is changing with it, but we don't yet know the consequences of those changes in terms of how individual fitness and population processes will respond to that change. So how important is ice to spectacled eiders? Are they ice dependent versus ice associated? I think we're on our way to finding out. So we'll kind of transition here from work that transmitter study, all those transmitters, the batteries are now past their functional life, so we don't have any locations from those birds anymore. But we have other work going on looking into some of these questions, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. That study I mentioned that was published by Christie et al., using banding data to estimate annual survival, in partnership and collaboration with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, we restarted that work in 2019. Went back out to Kigiak Islands and marked birds and recited bands. And this picture is Randall Friendly. He is a graduate student working on his master's degree. He is heading that project to continue the banding. And he is using over 20 years of data from that project and an additional 10 years of data from around Utqiagvik to look at how conditions on the wintering grounds, how these changes in sea ice might be affecting these birds during the breeding season. So he's a graduate student working with Mark Lindberg at UAF. We have plans to put out additional satellite transmitters. We were supposed to do that in May and June of 2019, and that work is in collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management and University of Alaska Fairbanks. The plan was to deploy transmitters not only on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, but also on the Arctic coastal plain to see how a larger and more spatially diverse sample of birds move around in the winter. Those plans are put on hold by the pandemic. We didn't get out last year, and it's looking like we won't get out this year. So hopefully next year. And then lastly, here's a photograph of a common eider that's banded. And if you look on the band, it has this little tag here. This is what's called a time depth recorder. So it's a device that measures temperature and pressure. And you can program them to turn on at certain times. So with the work that Randall is doing at Kigiak Island, he's going to be capturing and recapturing a lot of spectacled eiders. So the plan is to deploy some of these time depth recording tags on bands to look at how spectacled eiders feed in the winter. Like what do they need to do to meet the energy requirements of that harsh wintering environment? Because the female eiders return to nest in the same areas every year, we have a good chance of getting a lot of these tags back, and you need to get the tags back to get the data. So we have a lot going on with a lot of really great collaborators, and hopefully I have the opportunity to visit with you again to talk more about it in the future. But for now, that gets me to my last slide, and I want to say thank you very much for your attention, and thanks again to Gay and the Northwest Campus for this opportunity. And I'm more than happy to talk more about spectacled eiders with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dan. That was first off, beautiful graphics, but that was a very interesting presentation. And you already have questions, so there's some in the chat box, and if people get ready to ask questions, we'll start with the ones in the chat box.
All right.
Okay. And now, before I guess we'll go with the questions right now. So the first one was, I think, that popped up when you were showing the slide of the veterinarian doing his operation with the tag, and it was, please tell me they're not inserting the whole yellow thing into the body. So I don't know if you can go back to that.
Yeah, I can, but I can't give them the answer that they want. Yes, that entire tag does go into the bird. The anatomy of birds is super interesting and super different than us. Their respiratory system is very different, has these areas called air sacs, so essentially vacant space. So they have plenty of room for this tag. I want to emphasize, we certainly would not do anything that caused the bird to die. If we did that, we wouldn't get any useful data. So the point of this work is to get information that we can't otherwise get, because these birds winter, or actually they spend their entire year in really remote places, the remotest of which is the North Bering Sea in the middle of winter. And this is really the only way to get this kind of information. I appreciate their concern, though.
I have a question for that. Do you have any kind of information on that device so that if somebody were to either A, have it wash up, or I don't know if it floats or whatever, but be if there was you'd be surprised at what comes ashore here in the Bering Strait region, or if someone found a dead duck or whatever.
Yeah, there isn't any identifying information on the tag other than the frequency will be written on it. And that's the, the data are not stored on the tag. The tag at that point isn't going to be very useful. It would be interesting to learn where it's washed off. So I certainly encourage anyone that finds a yellow piece of electronics coated in yellow with an antenna coming out to let us know. It'd be interesting to see where it turned up, but it won't have any data on it that we would need to retrieve.
Right. Just something to think about. You'd be surprised what washes in.
Yeah.
Here.
It's not all glass floats.
No, not anymore. We just went through a big marine debris event this summer, so we see a lot of things we didn't normally used to see. The second question is, have you found a difference in breeding success among the birds that traveled so much during the winter?
That's a really great question. We don't have that information. I can tell you that the birds do return to the breeding areas, and I had a lot of great ambitions. In 2019, I was out at Kegiak Island where that banding and breeding study is, working with Randall, and I had a lot of ambition to find the eiders that returned to nest and to monitor their nesting. There are a lot of eiders on Kegiak Island, and the uncertainty around a satellite transmitter location can be, up to a kilometer, which when you're talking about where is the bird in reference to the entire Bering Sea, that's still useful information. But when you're talking about where is a spectacled eider on an island that's 4 kilometers wide, it's really hard. So we actually saw some birds flying around with antennas, but we didn't find any on a nest. UAF has a crew of waterfowl biologists that work at the Chautauqua River just to the north of where we are, and we marked birds with transmitters there too. And they actually did find 2 birds on nests with transmitters, which is really interesting to show, actually to document that they made nests, but to actually get an understanding of potential effects of that transmitter on breeding would take a much larger sample size. And then in addition to that, I think one of the most important factors that determines reproductive success is predators. Does your nest get found by a fox or not? So that wipes out, predation takes out enough nests that the remaining sample wouldn't be enough to make conclusions like that. It's a really relevant question that they've done work on other species with transmitters on. And the general pattern is that the bigger the bird and the smaller the transmitter, the better they do with it. It's not a good idea to put a big transmitter in a little bird. My impression is that spectacled eiders are tough birds.
All right, well, thank you. And you might want to, I don't know if you want to stop share your screen so people can see the star of the show bigger on there.
Yeah, I can go back if someone wants to see a slide, no problem.
Okay. And then the next question is, from Chad Ferguson, what was the cause of low ice 5,000 years ago? And are there any molecular markers that allow estimates of population sizes from that period? Oof.
That's a great question. I don't know that. So ice has certainly been lower. When you start talking in geological time, anything's possible, including a Bering land bridge. I think that study looking at the stable isotopes of oxygen from peat from St. Matthew Island, the limit, the farthest back those peat cores could take them was 5,000 years. So it wasn't that 5,000 years there was less ice, that there wasn't in that scope of time represented by those cores. But certainly ice has been lower in geological time. And then the genetics is out of my wheelhouse. I'm sorry. There are a lot of really smart people working on that. Maybe Gay can get someone to talk in this series about it, but that's out of my expertise. I'm sorry.
Actually, Matt Wooler is we haven't got him squared away with the time, but his St. Matthew Island research is on the docket. So
I will tune in for that. Matt is such a great speaker.
All right, and then I haven't seen anybody savvy enough to raise their hand with the thing, but we're still getting some in the chat box. You doing all right, Dan?
Yeah, I'm doing fine.
Okay.
The chat.
All right.
How do we get in the chat box? I'm sorry, we haven't figured that out yet.
Oh, well, if you want to ask a question, you're already right there live. Would you like to go ahead?
Okay, yes. I would like to know if does the implant transmitter shorten the life of the bird, or it doesn't make any difference in the lifespan of the bird?
That's a great question, Consuelo. Thank you for it. So the transmitters, their maximum functional life, given the battery, is 2 years. We have birds that reach that. So we have birds that we know at their last location were still alive. We also have birds that died. I showed that figure showing 23 years of annual survival estimate. Annual survival in an average year, not taking into account, so at optimal ice, survival is around 78%. So if you put out 100 transmitters after a year, you would expect that if the transmitter had no effect at all, of those 100 marked birds, 38 of them will die, just because life results in death eventually for us all. But that's a very good question, and it's tricky to sort out because it takes a lot of data. And when you're dealing with satellite transmitters, you don't really have the luxury of having a really big sample size because it's hard to capture a lot of birds. It's hard to do a lot of surgeries, and the transmitters themselves are very expensive. But there have been studies done in more convenient systems for birds that are more accessible. The USGS, Jerry Hupp in Anchorage did a really great study looking at implanted transmitters in the Canada geese that are in town and are easy to access. And I think he found not a large effect, which is not surprising. For a larger sized bird, they are pretty tough. When you start getting into smaller birds, that's when it becomes more of a concern.
How heavy is the transmitter?
45 grams.
And what is the weight of the bird itself?
1,500 grams. There's a lot of oversight, so we can't just buy a bunch of transmitters and start putting them in birds. Our protocols are reviewed in detail and require approval from a board whose responsibility it is to make sure that we are doing responsible work from the perspective of the bird. Yeah.
Advocates for the birds.
Advocates for birds, absolutely.
What is it that accounts for that particular piece of the Bering Sea being the place south of St. Lawrence Island where they gather why is that such a consistent, gathering place? Is there a certain population that lives there?
Clams.
You could do a dissertation on that, Fury.
Probably.
There are a lot of hypotheses about that. One of them, we have data to speak to one of them. And, one hypothesis is that they're pretty limited. And that's where they need to be, because if you think about ice flowing around St. Lawrence Island, it's a lot like water in a river flowing around a rock. And that downstream area, when the winds are persistently out of the north, is like the eddy. So the dynamics of how the openings in the ice come and go are a lot less variable than north of the island. And, that has been shown by work that Jim Lavorne has done with some of his graduate students, as well as people who study sea ice. Some other hypotheses include, Matt Sexton, I talked to him a lot about this, and he likes to talk about kind of the nightclub hypothesis. These birds pair up in the winter. So if you all go to the same place, you have a lot better chance of pairing up to breed the next year. And then there are hypotheses that also relate to prey densities. And there's a hypothesis that relates to that it's kind of lingering evidence of the former Bering Land Bridge coastline.
So there are just a couple. I see Dean Stockwell has his hand raised. Hang on one second, Dean. There is a comment from further north, just a comment really about the buoyancy issue with implants has been reported. Are those efforts are there efforts to reduce weight, etc.? sounds like that goes then long-term with implanted birds to monitor lung effects.
So I'm gonna turn off my mic.
All right, I just turned off my my video because it was sounding like Atari there. I think it might be my bandwidth. Can you please repeat the question and maybe I'll be able to get a better sense for it.
Dan, it's not you.
Yep, and it's related to the tag, and it was just that are there efforts to reduce the weight, and are there captive studies or implant studies with the birds to look at long-term effects? I hope we don't lose our speaker. Oh, he's
That's
back.
it. Yeah, yeah, that was a good point, Megan. That wasn't me. That's a great question, and there has been work done. Chris Laddie did some really great work using facilities at the Alaska Sea Life Center with common eiders and implanted transmitters. That work wasn't necessarily looking at long-term effects. He looked at how these transmitters affect really kind of fine-scale details about how they dive. And there was evidence that the transmitters changed things like the rate at which an eider gets to the surface, which isn't unexpected. But in terms of how relevant is that for an eider, and is it going to cause them to die? Is it an entirely different question? Sorry, Gay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to ask everybody turn off their video, except you, Dan, leave your video on. If you can just switch your video off, I think what is happening is you're overwhelming us in Gnome. For those of you who are just have your video on, we love to see you, but I think it is rough on pushing this out from my house.
Yeah.
So thank you. Stick with us though. And then you have, if that's okay, did you answer that when I was?
I did. I just want to point out there's another really recent study that's exceptional because it's drawn data from basically all of the studies using telemetry with sea ducks to date together. And that's a work by Juliet Lamb. And she found evidence that, having a transmitter does change the timing of when you decide to leave during migration. But again, a small effect. It's not like they're not deciding or staying weeks longer.
You've got lots of good, there's a couple more, if you can take it. People are asking, would you be willing to share your loon research sometime? And I am really going to put in a plug for that 22 results after you go for the 22 field season.
I
willing to share to give a talk on the loons. It looks like people are interested in that.
I love talking about loons. I don't get to do it often enough anymore. So I would jump at any opportunity to talk about loons.
All right. Awesome. Thanks. And then what are some of from Dave Rizzolo, this might be a family kind of thing. What are some of the predators of the birds, and are they a big threat to the decline?
Yep. Hi, brother. Thanks for tuning in. He's in Rhode Island. So some predators, so there's some interesting observations on that. On the nesting grounds, there are foxes that can take an adult. That seems to be pretty rare. If you think about their survival probability, most birds survive a year, right? So once you're an adult, your survival is pretty good. So they don't have a lot of predators. One really cool observation to share with you is an observation that Jim Lavorne made while looking at these birds from a helicopter on their wintering grounds. And he made an observation of walrus eating spectacled eiders in the ice, which is crazy. He wrote a paper on it. You should check it out.
And then a question from some people who would have good local knowledge of the region we're talking about. And the question is, as the winter ice recedes north, would there be good habitat for birds to adapt and winter farther north? Like if they have to go.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one that's really better answered by someone like Jackie Grebmeyer or Phil Stebino, who have been sampling and studying the creatures that live on the seafloor for a long time and have a lot of really great data. And the only comment I can make is kind of my familiarity with their work. And Jim Lavorne too, he's written a number of papers that put it in perspective of what eiders eat. And there could be, I think work that Jim Lavorne has done shows that kind of which species of clams are most abundant changes from year to year, and where they are changes from year to year as well. So it's pretty dynamic. And of course, if you're a clam and you're reproducing, you're putting off your gametes into the water, and where they end up and grow is entirely related to water currents. So where these areas of high density clams might be in the future might be very different from where they are now because of changes in wind and current.
All right, and then we'll go to Dan Mulcahy and then Dean Stockwell, who has been patiently waiting. Dan Mulcahy writes, as smaller transmitters are developed, we tend to put them into smaller birds. The smallest birds implanted have been godwits, shorebirds that manage to migrate nonstop 10,000 kilometers from Alaska to New Zealand and back to Alaska. But there are a couple of observations of malformed eggs from black-tailed godwits in Europe the year following implantation. There's always a balance between cost to the animal and value of the data. So that's a comment, and thank you, Dan Mulcahy, for that.
And I will add that Dan Mulcahy is a wildlife veterinarian who's probably put transmitters in more birds than maybe anyone. I've had the opportunity to work with him a lot, and he thinks deeply and thoroughly about these questions. So thank you, Dan.
All right, Dean Stockwell, thank you for waiting so patiently. Dean, have you got a question?
Yeah, Dan, first of all, nice talk, really enjoyed it. I'm going back to your habitat information. You showed a slide on the available foraging habitat from Lynn. The advantage that these eiders have always had is open water polynyas south of St. Lawrence being the proper water depth for them to dive and the appropriate food source being there. If you look kind of north, and if you look at the maps of Lynn, you see a lot of those available food sources are at a greater depth than these birds would wish to dive. So these birds have always taken in the past an advantage of that open water where they could roost and feed and have the food available. If you go north of there, their food availability drops. Can you make a better map of foraging habitats that would be preferential to these birds?
Yeah, thank you for that point, Dean. That's an excellent point that water depth is very important. You know, most of the Bering Shelf into the Chukchi Sea is shallow, but not all of it. In terms of making a better map, a lot of that work has happened. You know, they've sampled, for example, Ledyard Bay, where is a really important molting area for spectacled eiders, and you know, they spend weeks there growing new flight feathers. And if you look at the benthic samples, it doesn't jump out as a great place in terms of density of prey, but they make a living there. So I think, you know, two parts of that make it difficult is we don't fully understand, you know, the requirements of eiders, and then the dynamics of how benthic organisms change under, you know, normal conditions, but how they change now when conditions are kind of outside of data we have historically. But it's a great point. Thank you for it.
Yep, thank you for your answer. You should also know that Ledyard Bay is now one of the new hotspots for Alexandrium cysts, potential PSP intoxication, just to let you know.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, so appreciate it.
Yeah, and you know, increasing water temperatures and the implication for the abundance of those. Yeah, it's a new world, isn't it?
And so you had mentioned ship traffic, and that is something that we have, like you had mentioned, and I don't know if you mentioned it as to why it's a problem for the birds. The ships are not actually, you know, running over the birds or going through the area where the birds are. You might want to explain why eiders have an affinity for ships that is not good outcome for the bird, and that we have some vessels that you didn't mention, but we do have more of now, and we anticipate more in the future, would be research vessels, large military ships, and cruise ships. Those are all things that are, besides fishing and the tankers. But you might want to just touch on that so people, I don't know if everyone recognizes.
No, I do. You know, in terms of vessel traffic, yeah, I defer to you. You're much more on top of that subject than I am. But I will, you know, my understanding of lights is also not great. But just the quick take home is that birds are attracted to light at night. So these ships that are out have bright lights. The birds see them, are attracted by them, are confused and collide with the vessel and are killed. So that's the quick take on that. So if you have more boats floating around in areas where spectacled eiders are flying around, the eiders see the ice, are attracted to the boat, and then sometimes crash into the boat and are killed.
So we're talking about potentially having some industrial year-round traffic fairly soon. So that would just be something that for us in this region, we'd sort of kind of mull over maybe. All right. There's a biology student in Ontario, Canada. That has to be one of the farthest calls we've had for a straight science. And they want to know if anyone's working on eiders in Canada. And maybe if you're the student, perhaps you can leave your email in the box, in the chat box. Leave your email, and then maybe Dan will get some of these and he'll have your email and you guys can discuss that further on the side.
I'll just say that if you want to read about eiders in Canada, you're going to be reading for a long time. There's a lot of really great work on common eiders that comes out of Canada.
And so any other questions? You're getting some good comments. Please leave up, show a little love to Dan Rizzolo. It's not easy to do. Yeah, obviously you put a lot of time into that presentation. It's gorgeous, gorgeous pictures and very nice information, well delivered. And so the chat box, you're getting claps and all that. That's really nice. So all good. You have a big fan base. Well done. And I have probably the biggest question. Oh, go ahead.
This is Wes Jones.
Go ahead,
Dan,
Wes.
you spoke here on the wintering habitat. What have you learned about the molting habitat? Is that changing at all? Specifically, I'm interested in the Eastern Norton Sound portion. That was question one. And number two is there similar tag? You focused on the YK Delta breeding population. Are there similar tagging in the north? And then what are you seeing? Can you make any comparisons to the birds farther north? Are there some similar changes going on with them? Thank you.
Yeah, Wes, thank you. Those are all great questions. Our motivation for putting more transmitters out was for that exact reason. We wanted to expand the sample, the spatial frame of the sample from just the YK Delta to Arctic Russia or Arctic Alaska. Because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to do that. Margaret Peterson at the USGS, when she first put satellite transmitters in spectacled eiders in the 90s, she marked birds from all three breeding areas, including Arctic Russia, and showed that they all mixed together on the wintering ground. In terms of Norton Sound, I'm not familiar with any studies that show changes in prey base. There are studies of the prey base. There is a study Matt Sexton published with the satellite telemetry work he did with spectacled eiders that compared the distribution of birds in his sample in Norton Sound to the birds in the sample that Margaret Peterson marked in the 1990s. And he showed a shift to more near shore habitat between those two periods, and speculated that shift in distribution, it wasn't random. The statistics showed that, but that shift might be related to changes in prey.
Thank you. That's an important question. Wes, I had to deal with that ringing phone, but did you get answers to both your questions? Thank you, Dan.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Are there any plans to look at things like that molting area in the future to see if the birds are still there or if they've moved or moving to a new molting area?
Yeah, we actually used locations from this most recent sample of marked eiders and looked at distribution of birds in Norton Sound, and it matched almost exactly the distribution of the sample that Matt Sexton marked between 2008 and 2012. So more recently, there hasn't been a shift.
There has not, or has been?
not. Yeah, they're still going there, and they're going to the same place they were going to 8 to 10 years ago.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions for Dan? You've had a lot, but you had a lot of people coming, so that you're very patient.
No, this is the best part.
All right. Well, I actually have a giant question. My big question of the night is, I don't hear any accent, and I am a child of Aquidneck Island. Where in Rhode Island are you from?
I'm from Pawtucket, and I
All
can
right.
thank my lack of an accent to my mom, who's from Baltimore. So I say funny things like water instead of car.
We can talk later, but good on you. I didn't know that, so well done.
Thanks for
And
noticing.
to Rhode Island listening back home, thank you for joining your brother. My other question was, we did have avian cholera in 2013. It was kind of a scare for a lot of reasons. It affected many, many species of birds that it never affected before. Was there any evidence of it having affected the eider, the spectacled eider?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. You know, yeah. Caroline Van Hemert would be able to answer that in a second. And I know you had Caroline on recently, but I don't know.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. If there's no other questions, oh, yes, there is, Brianne. There's a whole lot of love here. That's awesome, and you deserve it. So, Brianne, is any follow-up studies of lead poisoning on the YK Delta? Any predator management on the? Oh, she's got a lot. Any predator management on YK Delta? Any surveying in the Russian Arctic? So the first part was lead poisoning, then predator management, YK, and any surveying in the Russian Arctic.
These, you know what questions to ask. Those are all incredibly important questions. So thank you for asking them. I'll start with the first, lead, and just for some background, there has been a lot of really great work coming out of the YK Delta by Paul Flint, showing that what certainly was a big factor, inhibiting recovery of eiders is their exposure to spent lead pellets from hunting. So people go out and hunt and they use lead. The lead pellets go into a pond and settle to the bottom, and the eiders actually seem to seek that out to use as grit. There aren't many pebbles out there, so if you find something hard and you have a gizzard, it pays to swallow it. The problem is lead is toxic, and work by Barry Grand and Paul Flint showed that eiders, based on banding data, an eider that has high levels of lead in its blood had its survival probability reduced by a half. And these birds are the breeding females that are most important to the population, and they're the birds in the population that spend the most time in the area where the lead is. So lead in the YK Delta was and could still be a really big issue. There's been a lot of great work that, Nisha Stelrite in my office has been doing out in the YK Delta, raising awareness. It's not illegal to sell lead shot, but it is illegal to use it for hunting on wetlands. And a lot of people don't know that. So a lot of the solving that problem is outreach and education and getting the lead out of the stores. And Nisha has done really spectacular work doing that on the YK Delta. Paul Flint, who did those initial studies, has plans, hopefully he can with the pandemic, to go back out to the same areas where he worked previously to revisit the lead question. He has models that predict what lead there should be if there was no additional lead added to the environment. So he'll be able to answer that question soon. Predator control is another big issue. We know that foxes have a really big effect on the probability of whether your eggs hatch or not. Foxes love to eat eggs and nests, right? The other side of that coin is that production for long-lived species isn't that important for the population. You can have years of bust. You can have a lot of years of bust, not a lot of young produced, as long as once in a while you have a good year because you breed for a long time. And that's kind of the Eiders strategy. But to promote recovery, there have been programs to control foxes, and that happened at Utqiagvik and Qeqertalik Island. Neither of those fox control programs are currently active. They could be reinitiated in the future, but they currently are not active. And then the last question, most spectacled eiders breed in Arctic Russia. That in Alaska, the Fish and Wildlife Service does an excellent job of monitoring those populations with aerial and ground surveys every year. That kind of work isn't happening in Russia, and that's one of the motivations for going out to the wintering grounds to take photographic surveys, because when you count them on the wintering grounds, you're counting everybody, And if you know who's in Alaska, you can subtract that away and get an idea of who's left in Russia. The only aerial surveys that had been done there were done in the mid-90s by Jack Hodges and his colleagues. Russian pilot biologists did fly aerial surveys for the first time since then, last summer. And folks in Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Management are working with their Russian colleagues right now to analyze those data.
All right. Well, thank you. I guess that made me, when you're talking, the Fish and Wildlife Service is talking to the Russians, there's the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council in
Yes.
Alaska with the acronym AMBCC.
Yes.
And I think that people I don't know if have given this presentation to that group, but certainly there's representation from this region. And I think that both at that level in the co-management, as well as our local Bering Strait, and I'm a little not so good on the seabirds, but there's a Bering Strait Seward Peninsula. If anybody's local that can help me with it, it's either the Rural Advisory Council or there's the local seabird or waterfowl group here on the Seward Peninsula that
Yes.
has representation from all our villages. I think people, hopefully you've already presented, but I think this presentation would be very interesting, and the discussion you would have with people afterwards would be probably really illuminating too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Had plans to go to the AMBCC meeting, but the pandemic happened. We do consult twice a year with the Association of Village Council Presidents, which is the body that represents the 56 Alaskan Native villages on the Yukon-Kuskokwim region. So we do those intergovernmental consultations twice a year. And we go there mainly because that's where we were catching birds and marking them. Given you're right that this study is much broader than that because the birds come up into the Bering Strait and they go in the Arctic. So yeah, I agree. Presenting at AMBCC and consulting with them is important, and it's on on our radar to do that.
Great. There's somebody that's been writing on the side from Todd's iPhone, and yes, the Straight Sciences are recording. We're recording right now. Are they available? We're getting there, and they will be ultimately put on a website, a new website that's on a new page as part of the UAF Northwest Campus website. So that will be coming up. And also, I think that Alaska Sea Grant is going to try to get these onto a format with YouTube. But as you can see from my excellent recording skills, they're going to need to be a little bit edited. So as the start and the stop. So they will be available, but just be patient while we get that sort of settled out. So I hope that answers that. And for the people, there was people that were asking, yes, these are Brittany's Spaniels. Oh, I guess people are watching everything, the Eiders and the dogs. So very good. And with that, if there's no other questions, thank you so much, Dan. I'll make sure you get a copy.